So our format for today is that we'll start with a few minutes of presentation and introduction. I'm going to ask Ann Hancock, our co-founder and chief strategist, a couple questions to get us going here and do a brief introduction about the Climate Safe California campaign, and have hopefully 45 minutes for your questions and answers and discussion together. So jumping right into that, I want to welcome Ann Hancock, who is co-founder of the Climate Center and chief strategist, and co-founded the Climate Center in 2001. She has over 25 years of fantastic community leadership and education and fundraising expertise. She was a sustainability planner for the County of Marin, commentator for TomPaine.com, taught human sexuality at Humboldt State University, and was a real estate broker. She has a master's in public health administration and planning from the University of California at Berkeley. And you know, Ann is an amazing person. She's been the executive director at the Climate Center up until a few months ago. She hired me to be the CEO and still playing an incredible, valuable, incredibly important leadership role at the Climate Center. She's brilliant, strategic, visionary, and very humble. So welcome, Ann.
Wow, thank you.
So Ann.
My beloved community. Well, so nice to see you in this kind of coronavirus era communication means. So Ellie asked me to present a little bit of the background, and I thought it would be useful to talk about mostly about the DNA that started the whole thing off. It was a vision about how do we make the world a better place, and I think everybody on this Zoom call is like-minded in that regard. And so my co-founder, Mike Sandler, and I were both learning about Cities for Climate Protection. Cities for Climate Protection was about local action moves the world. And I just loved that slogan. And I loved the program, which married for local governments doing the right thing and saving money too. And that's a message that can really work. It still does. For policymakers. And it's the the Cities for Climate Protection program is still the best program I know that's international, that incorporates think globally, act locally. So Mike and I decided that we would get all 9 of our cities and the county pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get them on the 5-step program of Cities for Climate Protection. And our vision was that we would rock the world by having Sonoma County be a national leader. And indeed, that's what happened. In the ensuing years, Sonoma County set, depending on how you count them, 10 national precedents and inspired communities all around the United States. So the DNA in, even in those early days, are important things that still hold, even when we were looking at lessons learned from coronavirus era, and they still hold true. So first of all we need action at speed and scale. And for us, it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's not the only thing that we need to do, but if we don't do that, it's game over. And so that continues to be the, you know, kind of bedrock for our organization. We also believe in no shame, no blame. We're all in this together. And that's one of the lessons that is coming out from coronavirus. It's we, not me, that we have to, you know, if the contagion is contagious and you can't really shield yourself without protecting everyone, without dealing with everyone. And the other part of the DNA is that science rules, that we have to heed the science. And then once again, that speed and scale action is what can lead to a better outcome and to a better future. So we did the Cities for Climate Protection program, inventories, set a target, make a plan, follow your plan, keep on tracking. And out of making the plan, we had one of our really high priority programs in which we've invested years of work, and that is community choice, because that's the most powerful thing that a local government at least in California, can do to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions at speed and scale. And that the upshot of that was Sonoma Clean Power. And then what we're seeing is more than a quarter of Californians now are part of community choice. Those community choice agencies are delivering 88% green electricity. And it's really a disruptive, positive change that has been caused by policy. So at the local level, but it required enabling legislation to make it happen. So we really saw how local action can move the world, but also it was clear looking at what we had to do with our transportation emissions, especially in Sonoma County, that local action moves the world, but only so far. And so that is why we have refocused the geographic scope of our organization to the state level. And we'll get into more of that about Climate Safe California, our campaign to
So
really,
Ann,
yes.
I'm going to interject. I just want to say thank you for that. Before we go further, I just want to remind people, for those of you who may not know this, at the top of your photograph area here on Zoom, it says speaker view, or you can change it to little box view. I don't know what they call it. So just if you want, when somebody's speaking, if you just want to look at them and not look at the rest of us, you can do that. And you'll just have small little squares of everybody. Or you can have a gallery view of everybody. You also see that there are multiple pages, so you can scroll through the pages to see whoever else is on the call, just to remind you of that. And Ann, back to you. I wanted to ask you, Ann.
Well, before we go on, I forgot to show a little call out to Mike.
Okay, please do.
So that's a photo of Mike and me in 2002. We took a busload of people down to San Francisco when, at the time, Governor Gray Davis was signing the historic AB 1493. This was Fran Pavley's tailpipe emission bill that inspired action throughout the United States and Canada, and now is being challenged by the Trump administration. But anyway, this was a glorious day, and you can kind of see the expressions on our face about how happy we were to be there with, you know, with that busload of people and moving and shaking there. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing right now if I can figure out how to do this.
Up at the top, the little red button.
Okay, nope. Nope. Here, let me get out of this. Nope.
There's a little red button that says stop screen share.
Oh, there it is. Okay, got it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ann. So I wanted to ask you, now, as with all this incredible work of the Climate Center, and especially with the growth of the CCAs, that the community choice energy agencies that today are serving over 11 million Californians, 88% clean energy, and that most of that growth happened in the past 5 years, that is a fantastic example of rapid decarbonization. And out of that, in the last couple of years, you've been working on what we call the theory of change, our theory of change at the Climate Center. It's really our strategy for getting to accelerated and rapid greenhouse gas reductions. And do you want to just briefly explain that to everybody?
Sure, happy to. First of all, I'll start with, after having had hundreds of conversations with people, I think anybody who is out to make the world a better place has a theory of change about how to do that. But usually, almost always, it's implicit. And so what we've done at the Climate Center is make explicit what our theory of change is. And I'm going to rant a little bit here. I don't understand why this isn't more of a discussion within all movements, but especially the climate movement. I don't understand how we can invest all this money and time and energy without getting clear on what those strategies are that actually are effective for moving and shaking the world. So that's part of the work that we have done, is to start the verb is, I think, socializing theory of change, to bring it out and say, what is your theory of change to heads of other organizations? And what do you think of our theory of change? So I'm going to once again share the screen here and show you, let's see if I can do this better. Oops. Our model of our theory of change here. And I know many of you have already talked about this with me. Let's start on the right-hand side with the vision, a positive future for ourselves, our children, and all life. And we know, as we said earlier, that unless we reduce greenhouse gas emissions at speed and scale, it's game over. This isn't the only thing that we have to do to achieve our vision, but it's a necessary thing, one of the necessary things that we have to do. And in order to achieve speed and scale greenhouse gas emission reductions, we have to change human behavior on a massive level. So how do we do that? That is the key question right there. And according to science, we have about 10 to 12 years to really make a radical change in how we emit greenhouse gas emissions. And so this comes down to, how do we make choices about what we consume as businesses and as individuals? So we believe that price signals are the most powerful way to massively, rapidly influence people's consumption choices. And how do we do that? We have to unleash market forces. And we've seen this with solar, that when the solar industry really kicked into gear, and it still is unfolding, that we were able to dramatically lower the price of solar installations. And then that created a virtuous cycle that increased the amount of solar installations, which drove the prices down even further. How did solar start accelerating like that? It was kickstarted largely by policy that incentivized businesses, that incentivized R&D, so that we could see that virtuous cycle result. So then we have to change the policies in order to produce that result in other areas. And we've seen this somewhat in electric vehicles. And we have to have the right policymakers so that they're willing to vote for the right policies. How do we get that? We don't need everybody. According to research, this is Erica Chenoweth's research, you only need about 3.5% of the population to make the kind of change that we're talking about. And in fact, there's a new video documentary that's come out. I don't know if you've seen it, called Crip Camp. And my neighbor is in it, and it's very inspiring. It's available on Netflix, and it shows that
Ann, sorry, can you say again, just say a little slower, what the name of it is?
Crip Camp, CRIPCAMP, just came out. Barack Obama and Michelle Obama are the executive producers. It may win an Academy Award, but it shows how even a smaller group of people can change the world. It's really an inspiring documentary. So how do we get those people geared up, even less than 3.5%? It takes people like you all on this video or this Zoom recording to move and shake so that we actually make this theory of change happen. Before leaving, I want to talk about the two caveats down below. Change is nonlinear, and all models are wrong, some are useful. We know that there's lots more than this very, very, very simple model that goes into changing the world. But this is our explicit model that starts a conversation about how we can align and really become more powerful as a movement, more powerful as an organization.
Thank you very much, Ann. I'm going to do just one more slide right now, and then we're opening it up for Q&A. I do just want to remind, because I don't really need to remind everybody, that in this context of COVID-19, first, I just want to say on behalf of all of us at the Climate Center that we hope all of you and your families are safe and healthy right now. It is a really frightening time. There is we know that what we learn from COVID-19 is what we know is also true for the climate crisis, that we ignore science at our peril and our collective peril, and that preparing in advance saves lives. We're seeing this again and again at COVID-19, and it clearly applies to climate as well. And so in that context, our efforts on Climate Safe California, our campaign, are even more critical to keep moving forward, because as we know, actually I'm going to share with you this one cartoon. Let me find it if I can really quickly here. Maybe it's not that quick, so I'm not going to do it right now. I really want to get to our discussion together. So I'm going to share my screen, and you should see my, here, let me move this over. There you go. And our campaign for Climate Safe California is on rapid decarbonization. In the early days, we were calling it our Rapid Decarbonization Campaign. And we decided that we needed to, oh, hold on, we needed to be able to, sorry, let me move this down, that we needed to come up with a more positive way of thinking about it and really looking towards the future here. So we changed the name to Climate Safe California, and it is to rapidly decarbonize California's economy. And our real goal is to accelerate existing state goals to achieve by 2030, 80% below 1990 greenhouse gas levels of emissions and net negative emissions, which is sequestration greater than emissions, where California becomes a net carbon sink. There was an executive order from Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005 that enshrined this 80% below 1990 level into our state goals. And then net negative emissions was part of Jerry Brown's executive order in the fall of 2018 that called for carbon neutrality by 2045, followed by net negative emissions. And we decided not to refer to carbon neutrality. We think that's a false goal. A lot of countries around the world, the EU and others, and many companies are making carbon neutrality their goal. And we know that carbon neutrality isn't enough. What the science is telling us is not only do we have to dramatically reduce emissions, but we also have to begin pulling out up to 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents of greenhouse gas warming emissions that are in the atmosphere. So our real goal by 2030 is to get California to net negative emissions. And I'll just show this really quickly here. The left bar shows the 1990 baseline. This gold bar is where we are today. This is over 400 million metric tons of emissions per year. Here's the zero line down here. This is what's in state policy right now, is to get us to 40% below 1990 levels. Where we need to be is some combination of emissions reductions and sequestration below the zero line to get us to net negative emissions. And I see that Ed is on the call here, and I'll just show you. Ed Myers helped us out by devising some pathways, if you will, to Climate Safe California. And this shows in the areas that the state is assessing now, that we're measuring now, doesn't include consumption-based emissions, but these are the categories the state's measuring now. Some of the categories and the way percentage of emissions reductions, what we would need to get to by 2030 net negative emissions. So this, for example, shows in transportation an 80% reduction in emissions from transportation, with 100 million metric tons of sequestration happening annually to get to minus 14 million metric tons a year, or net negative emissions. So that's all I'm going to show right now. I'm going to stop my share. And what I'd love to do is open up for Q&A. I'm going to go now to find, okay. So Helen has the first question here. Welcome, Helen. Glad to have you with us today. Helen Marsh, can you comment on the value of pushing city councils to pass climate emergency resolutions? Given how much time and effort is involved in doing this, do you think it's a good use of volunteer and citizens' time? Excellent question. So Ann and I are gonna, Ann, you can join me in answering questions, and I'll start myself. I think that the climate emergency campaign overall has been a great idea. The concept of climate emergency has, I think, catalyzed more people to look at the climate crisis as the crisis that it is, accelerating and increasingly endangering the future of life on our planet. So from that sense, I think it's valuable. I think today that if you have a climate emergency resolution that has no teeth to it, that it is not worth it. I personally serve on my town, San Anselmo's Sustainability Commission. It's a tiny town, 12,000 people. After years of working on climate change, I realized that it was important to participate in local government, as Ann talked about, and to learn for myself, what does it really take to make these changes? It's been very eye-opening. And so we have a climate emergency resolution. We have a climate action plan. We have spreadsheets of actions we want to take with budget amounts. How many of those things have actually been implemented today? Maybe one. So it's a great question, Helen. Ann, anything you want to add? Oh, you have to unmute, Ann.
That was good. I have nothing to add. I want to hear more questions.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. From, I apologize if I'm saying this name incorrectly, Zeno Swittink. Thank you for your question. What new opportunity for climate action at speed and scale does the pandemic provide us? Fantastic question. Personally, I think that the opportunity is the pandemic made this personal for everybody. Climate change should be personal for everybody, but not everybody sees it that way, because you can go about business as usual as other people around the world are suffering. What the pandemic has done, in my opinion, has shown that everyone is impacted by this global threat. And that's the same with climate change. What we have seen is that with COVID-19, an unbelievably fast response from governments at all levels and all over the world, and all kinds of governments, all forms of governments responding rapidly to contain the threat. So whatever's most important to those governments, whether it's the stock market, I won't say what country it is that thinks the stock market's most important, I think you can guess, or at least what government it is, or other countries that are really looking at the well-being of their human population and their wildlife and nature, their wildlife populations and habitats and environments. Clearly, we can act at speed and scale to make a difference. There's no question. I mean, you can look at it from a justice point of view, and how much money is going from conservative Republicans. I just read an article this morning arguing for 80% of people's salaries to be paid to every worker in the country, from some of the most conservative people in government today. So I think what we're looking at is the ability to act quickly when people feel threatened. And I think the coronavirus opens up this opportunity for us to make climate change and show that the actions that we're asking for climate change are actually less dramatic than some of the actions that are happening right now for COVID-19. Ann?
I think that one of the biggest things that the pandemic has shown us or done to us is expand the realm of possibility. I think it shows what's possible, that we can actually work together as a planet. And that may be the biggest thing that it does if we leverage it positively.
Okay, great. Thanks, great question. From Barbara Moulton. Hi, Barbara. Glad to have you with us. How do accelerated goals translate into enforceable, effective policy? That's a great question.
Bing, 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 bing. That's a really good question.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again. Hold on here. What I'm showing here is our platform. And this has been very interesting. I say this for Barbara and everybody. We've gotten a lot of feedback. We've probably interviewed or met with, what do you think, Ann, 50 different individuals and organizations now?
More.
So we really all over the state and also some national folks. So what we're looking for is, how do we frame our campaign so that we're not recreating the wheel that somebody else is already doing? In fact, when we started this work together last summer, we said if we found another group doing this, we would join them. We didn't need to do it ourselves. And what we found is that in the climate world, there are a lot of organizations working in their own silos, maybe around clean energy, maybe around health, maybe around environmental justice, maybe on labor issues. There's not a single entity that's bringing it all together with this big vision of where we need to be based on the current climate science and the actual acceleration of climate impacts, and the fact that we've already activated 9 of 15 global tipping points. So we started looking at this, and the feedback that we got was to be very clear about where we want to be by 2030 and be more general about the policies that it takes to get there, so that as the policies are developed by the state leaders in the legislature, in different departments, and from other leaders around the state, that people can co-own it. So what we came up with, we have a much more detailed platform that's available online. You can go to climatesafeca.org or to theclimatecenter.org, and you can read the entire platform with all the science behind it. But this is our summary. We're calling upon California to enact the following: that by 2022, we commit to 80% below 1990 levels and net negative emissions by 2030, as I've already told you. To close the climate gap for lower income communities, for those frontline communities that have bared the brunt of climate change and of fossil fuel industry and the pollution from it, and are the people who are most vulnerable today to COVID-19 because of that exposure to that air pollution in particular. Commit to a secure transition for workers. Our goal is to ensure that all the people who are employed directly or indirectly through fossil fuel industries have some way to see how they can take care of their families and have health care and live the way they need to live in order to move forward to securing a climate safe future. And then, enact the policies required by science. And so these are the 4 main categories we've laid out: accelerating the phase out of fossil fuel development, production, and use. And a subset of that includes enacting as soon as possible, shutting down any new leasing and licensing of new oil and gas development. Some of you may have heard that just a week ago, the governor, like on Friday afternoon, it was late Friday, there were 60, I think, new leases allowed for gas drilling in Kern County. Very surprising, very disturbing, especially in the context of COVID-19, where it will create a lot more pollution for people in that area and make them even more sensitive to the impacts of coronavirus. Increased sequestration, as we've discussed, it means really finding ways, investing in a big way to healthy soils, healthy habitats, managing the habitat that we have so we don't lose more carbon, and investing in habitat restoration so we can sequester an additional 100 million metric tons by 2030. Part of our thinking on that is that if you don't, there are technological approaches to pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. They are in very nascent stages, maybe 12 or 15 around the world, that are sequestering a tiny amount. We hope that by the 2030s, they will be scaled up. In the short term, we have to find how we can begin sequestering those emissions from the atmosphere while also providing other benefits that increase resilience, that increase food security and water security. And that's what this can do. Third area is investing in community resilience. That includes community energy resilience and our ability to withstand increasing fires and floods and heat days. And last is funding climate action. The cap and trade is not enough. We are looking at other kinds of funding mechanisms, including fee and dividend approach in California. And we are promoting a frequent flyer fee. But of course, not many people are flying right now. But at some point, I imagine we'll get back to a lot of people flying. And I can elaborate on that more. But I just want to summarize our approach is to have a broad stroke policy outline with very clear goals of where we want to get to, and have these things filled in over time by policymakers. Ann, anything you want to add to that?
I want to add that this is the model that AB 32 took and was successful in driving policy change in California, as we know. So that's part of the feedback we got, was somebody who was very involved in AB 32, and he said this is a good way of politically and actually, you know, from a solutions point of view, going about pushing these policy changes.
I do want to highlight on specific policy. For the first time, the Climate Center has been a major lead in bringing about two pieces of legislation in the state legislature. The state legislature is out right now. They are planning to come back in May. We don't know when they will come back or how they will reconvene. But these two bills we think are really critical to the governor's current priorities, which include obviously COVID-19, but also homelessness and fire. And so the first is enacting utility reform, which is to transition to an open access market that allows everybody and anybody to sell clean energy to one another, and really helps us build a more resilient, decentralized future grid. And the second is community energy resilience planning, SB1314, that provides funding for, provides the basis for eventual funding to local governments all over California, prioritizing low-income communities in fire-prone areas to plan for and implement clean energy microgrids and backup power, so that when the power is shut off, either intentionally or not, that they can continue to support critical facilities like hospitals and healthcare facilities and schools and public safety facilities. So I'll stop with that for right now.
Okay, let me add to that. I want to do a shout out to Kurt, who's on the call, and Barry, and Lorenzo Christoph, who's also on the call, for being the trust of people, team of people who are really moving these two pieces of legislation forward. And Lorenzo, thank you for being the inventor of this approach for creating more resilient communities.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Next question from David Coulthard. How are you doing, David? Following Ann's theory of change slide, which wonderfully began with the end goal, can we affirmatively use the great clean air we are now experiencing, the blue skies we are enjoying, as real consequences of our actions, even though now it is for protective reasons? Ann, you want to answer that?
Well, yeah, I think the answer is yes. And that's what we were talking about, is this new realm of possibility has opened up with this dramatic, swift response to the pandemic. And you know, we can feel and see this clean air. We have people on our team in the Central Valley area, and it's so wonderful to talk to them. They say, oh, the air is so clear. It's so clean. I can go out now and enjoy myself. And it's just an example of what people around the world are experiencing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. From Mike Turgeon, has any consideration been given to simplifying the language even more in order to allow uninitiated folks to have easier access to the problem?
Yes,
That's
yes.
great, Mike. Thank you. We will continue to work on that. I should say our overall goal for this campaign is we think that we have to raise about $25 million to enact everything we want. And part of what we want to do is hire communications experts to work with us on just that. We've done a lot of work from feedback we've gotten, but we are not communications experts. We're not marketers. And if any of you first of all, could make a $25 million donation, let us know. Or maybe you know someone who is a marketing expert who would volunteer their time to work with us, a marketing professional. We'd love to meet that person and get their help. We also need more voices telling the story. So I have my PowerPoint that I tell, but we want more people to tell this story from where they sit and where they are, and in simple ways that can motivate people to help us secure a climate-safe California, which we hope will catalyze action from other states, the nation, and the world to ultimately get to a climate-safe Earth.
And Mike, thank you for that question, and thank you for all the work that you're doing to bring the message home and convert it into actual making a difference at the local level. And so you and everybody here, if you have ideas for messaging, please let us know. We really are very open to feedback.
Absolutely. Thank you. From Paul Berry. Thank you, Paul. Please explain what distributed energy is and how this is one of the most significant ways to move to zero emissions. So Kurt, please.
Well, to put it succinctly, the utility architecture we've had for the last 100 years is based on this idea that there's a distant power plant which is sending power to us via transmission lines and then distributed to us as consumers. And it's what we've been doing for 100 years, and we have rapid technological changes, most specifically rapidly declining prices in solar, distributed storage, and the proliferation of electric vehicles, which hasn't existed before. Once you change to a mindset of needing to capture all that energy and using it locally, you can take advantage of opportunities which you wouldn't otherwise unless you were thinking about how to meet local energy needs with local generation. So a couple examples. There is a rapid proliferation in electric vehicles, which if part of a local energy ecosystem can be tapped into to provide that resilience and load balancing daily, utilizing all the solar which is coming online. Another example, we have right now a huge solar fleet, utility scale, typically distantly located, and we also have a rapidly increasing distributed rooftop solar fleet. Well, what's happening now, even as we've seen in PSPS events, is when the grid is shut down, all of that distributed solar, by law, currently goes offline. It's not being captured and utilized because the way distributed PV works, when the grid goes down, all that PV comes offline. If we thought differently about how to basically re-energize at a local level, we could start capturing all that PV, which is currently being wasted.
And Kurt, what is PV? We'll try not to use acronyms.
Photovoltaics, yeah. So right now, when PSP events happen, the grid goes down, and all that PV, all that local solar is wasted because we don't have a way of capturing it locally. If we started reimagining the utility system built on a sort of a bottom-up basis of islands of electrical load matched with electrical generation, we would create a very different utility architecture and capture all those benefits in a way that haven't been previously.
That's great. Thank you, Kurt. And distributed energy, to me, the way I like to describe it is decentralized, and as a part of that. Thank you, Kurt. That's great. From Daniel Barnes. It says in the Climate Safe California Initiative that the organization will be working on securing a positive transition for workers and families who base their livelihoods on the fossil fuel industries. What state and national partnerships will be developed to make this happen? Great question. So there's a national partnership, which we are now part of, that is called the LN, I got to remember what it stands for. I will find it and share it with you. But we just started becoming a part of it in the last 2 weeks, and there was a national conference call the other day that resulted in an article in The Hill focused on members of Congress to be sure that workers are getting the support they need, especially the workers at the bottom end of the economy that sustain our way of life and who are on the front lines of the coronavirus. And this coalition brings together environmental groups and labor groups to work on national policy. There are also some coalitions here in California that are working on that. And we are part of something called Green California that includes some labor interests. And Ann, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
So that is a great question, and it really brings home how we have to, once again, we're all in this together, and we have to have solutions that take that into consideration. And politically, the labor is one of the most powerful forces in Sacramento. So if we want to succeed, because we want to succeed in Sacramento with our political solutions that enable the theory of change to happen, we have to work with labor in order to make it happen. So one of the things that we've done, one of the first things that we did was hire a labor consultant, a strategist, who is helping us determine how are we going to work with labor going forward. And it's really a very, I guess, juicy topic about creating a partnership. And in fact, we did this in Sonoma County when we were lifting up community choice. We were working with the labor community to be supportive of this effort. And so we have to do that in the same way for the state of California.
Yeah, the national group is called Labor Network for Sustainability. And just to reinforce what Ann said, we are targeting and working with building relationships with various labor entities across the state.
Yeah, we welcome ideas. Maybe you are members of the labor community. Maybe you have ideas about how we can work with labor. We would welcome that.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. As Dan Kamen, who's a professor at UC Berkeley and a lead climate voice in the state on policy as well as science, he said, we are only as resilient as the most vulnerable. And that is an important principle for us in this Climate Safe California campaign. From Aaron Daly, thank you, Aaron. What do you think are the greatest barriers to the change needed? That's a great question. I'll start, and then Ann would love for you to join in. Right off the top of my head, my response to that is, ultimately, it's about, for each of us, we respond to things based on where we sit, literally, how we are in our own homes with our families and our lives. And that's what's so unbelievable about coronavirus, that it doesn't discriminate at all. Truthfully, climate change doesn't either, but those with more means have the ability to avoid the worst consequences more than those who have fewer means. And so I think the biggest barrier is being complacent and so comfortable in our business as usual lives. I really believe that. But as Ann talked about, we only need a small percentage of people to make big change. I've been part of a national campaign in the 1980s that involved 2,000 people that changed a vote in Congress. And I believe that we can make democracy work for us if we're super strategic and super focused on the goals, and figure out who are the right constituencies to engage and mobilize those voices to focus on the key things in Sacramento. We can do that here in the state. But there are barriers to change, and it is the comfort of our lives. One other addition to that is that in Marin County, we know that we're only measuring 1/3 of our actual emissions. So we're really not measuring 2/3. And where are those emissions? Out of boundary emissions that aren't counted when we're thinking about what are the real contributions we each make to climate change. And so those consumption-based out of boundary emissions are really critical. They're tied to this question. The biggest barrier is that I can get on the phone right now or on my iPhone, my mini computer, and order something and get it tomorrow from Amazon, even now. And what's the cost? What is the environmental cost? What's the labor cost of that, to that convenience and the way we live today? Ann, anything you want to add, or other?
I do. I want to say that I think vested interests are one of the big parts of the problem. And maybe you could say that because we live so comfortably, we're part of that vested interest. But you can't ignore politics, nor the moneyed fossil fuel industry and all that they do to prevent the types of action that we need, state level, national level, international level. So that's why we have to mobilize. We will never have the money that they have, but we can have the people power and we can make a difference. You know, I believe that we morally are thinking about the future and not thinking about our vested interest, and that we have to mobilize around this shared vision that we have.
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, we are just completing an application to a foundation to help fund this effort. And the last question is, what are the barriers to doing this? And clearly a focus on COVID-19 is a barrier. So these two bills that we have in the state legislature right now, we have to reframe them or continue to frame them in the context of fire and health. And we already were starting to do that, but we will need to do that much more. In terms of funding, we not only want to keep the staff that we have at the Climate Center, we want to grow it. We have about 5 new positions we've identified in order to carry out this campaign. And we want to give money to partners to participate in this. And so money, you could think of money as a barrier for carrying out the campaign. So there are a number, we think we can overcome all of them. And just having all of you with us today makes me feel really optimistic about what's possible. So thank you.
Ellie, if I may add, you know, these are such great questions, and this is kind of a funny format. So, because, you know, for example, I think it was Aaron, you asked that question about what are the barriers. I would love to hear what you have to say. And Barbara, you said, you know, what are the speed and scale solutions? I would love to hear what you have to say. So it really is, you know, a little bit funny that just Ellie and I are giving the answers when everybody else has some really good answers too.
Yeah. Thank you, Ann. Okay, it's 11:54. I just want to be sensitive because we're going to wrap up at noon. From Bruce Hagan. Hi, Bruce. Glad to have you with us. A follow-up to Helen's question. Would there be significant value for the organizers and supporters of these campaigns, as well as their elected leaders and staff, to be part of an organized collection of efforts to achieve climate-safe California? Share strategies, tactics, tools, and resources, recruit other climate groups, or better, let these efforts operate entirely independent of each other? Ann?
Well, we think that that's one of the biggest impediments is the lack of alignment in the climate movement and the lack of, you know, using evidence-based strategies. So yes, Bruce, you know, definitely yes.
Yeah. I do want to say that Joel asked a question here. Hasn't this pandemic and shelter in place demonstrated that greenhouse gases can be greatly reduced by reducing how much we drive our vehicles? Yes. I do want to be clear that the global climate system has decades of extra energy in it. So even if we stopped all of our emissions permanently today, we would still be experiencing accelerating climate impacts for the next 2 to 3 decades. So we just have to understand that it's like a giant bathtub full of water that's been with the spigot completely open. And right now we've almost closed the spigot. The bathtub is still full and we still got to figure out a way to empty that. And so that's the combination of emissions reductions and sequestration that needs to happen. From Sarah Zimmerman, what mechanisms do you anticipate for ensuring accountability and enforceability? So again, that question came up earlier, and maybe I think I didn't answer it because I don't totally know the answer. But it's going to require, just like the laws that we already have in place in California, that from clean cars to clean energy to the CCAs to other mechanisms for improving the health of our climate and our population. Some of them are very directly enforceable and some are more indirect. And so it requires cities and counties taking action with support from the state. There are a number of ways that we're going to get to this 2030 goal of net negative emissions. And it's a challenge. If you think about accountability itself, and we're only measuring the list that I showed before, and we're not including consumption-based emissions even. If we're not even counting all of our emissions, how is it that we can get to accountability and enforceability? So there are definitely some challenges along the way here, but that ultimately is the goal. It has to be accountable and enforceable, but we need more of the population to want it, to also make it really adopted. And ultimately, our theory of change is that by having an infusion of support from the state government and ultimately the federal government, we'll be able to make change a lot more quickly on the ground, both cultural change and change in terms of our behavior.
I would like to add a little bit to that. I actually think this is a very, very, very important question. And I think that it's easy to lose track of things when, you know, there's the newest issue or the newest push or something like that. And we have to structure in accountability, but even that's not enough. I think that there have to be outside watchdog groups that are willing to sound the alarm when things are going off track. And it's kind of annoying, I guess, to think of, you know, an ongoing effort that's needed that may not be as sexy as putting these policies into place. But I actually think that that's part of what will make it succeed in the long run.
Yeah, okay. So I want to acknowledge there were several questions about enforceability and how we work towards enforceable effective policy. We're really out of time to be able to do that today. There's questions about banking, about rural areas, action in rural mountain counties from Charles Plopper. There's, you know, there are really, these are all fantastic questions. Solutions that don't involve dollar signs. So I think what we're going to have to do is we'll capture all the questions. Hopefully we can respond to you with separate from our session today. I would like to begin to wrap up, and I'm sorry that we didn't, I mean, there's so much to discuss. We would love your feedback. Should we do this again? Should we do it in a different format? Should we allow only 25 people to come on at a time and have everybody's mics open so we can talk back and forth? Like, what should we, you know, we had, I think over 120 people sign up for this, and it looks like we have 60 or 70 who joined us today. So we're just love having you here, trying to figure out, we're learning as you are how to use Zoom and these kinds of video conferencing approaches to be part of community with you to solve these questions. These are really helpful questions. We'd love your answers to some of these questions. In fact, I think maybe one thing we can do, I'm just brainstorming here with you or to you. Can you brainstorm 2 people? That we'll take the list of questions and email them out to everyone, all the questions that we got today. And if you have suggestions for answers to those questions, for what we should be doing to help ensure that we can achieve net negative emissions, which somebody also said isn't the greatest. I agree totally. Another way that is talked about is that we would become a carbon sink. What does that mean? Another way to talk about it is sequestration is greater than emissions. It's real. We have not found the way to talk about it. If you have ideas, whoever comes up with the best idea will definitely win a prize. I don't know what the prize is yet. And so we really welcome any questions or comments. You can still type them in and we'll send them out to everybody. And I see there are a lot more questions that have come in towards the end here, and we're really grateful for that. I just want to thank you all again for joining us. I want to thank Woody for collecting the questions and making them easy for us to refer to, Kurt for being part of this, Nina for your technical prowess and making sure this works so smoothly today. We're really grateful. Especially want to thank Ann for your vision, your leadership, your humility, and it's just great working with you on this. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being part of our Climate Safe California community. I mean, it takes more than the village to make this happen. And it really is about our collective future. So thank you all for being part of the Climate Center family. And we look forward to being in touch and really do appreciate your feedback and recommendations. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.